On to our second topic, prison radicalisation. In this week's issue, Ian Aitchison describes how Islamist ideologies are thriving in British prisons. I'm now joined by Douglas Murray and Tom Gash, a crime policy advisor and the author of Criminal, The Truth About Why People Do Bad Things, to discuss. So Douglas, does Ian's piece fit with what you've come across with regards radicalisation in Britain?
Well, it's a very interesting piece. Ian Aitchison, some listeners may know, was asked by Michael Gove, when he was then the Justice Secretary in 2015, to carry out a review into this matter, which he did. The findings were published, the entire review wasn't, but it did have some very worrying findings when they were released, and he's extrapolated that out in this piece, not least in the wake of developments in the current government, cuts and so on. But it is a very worrying picture. It's a worrying picture that he discovered when he was given the role that he was given. And what he reveals in this piece is even more worrying, which is that it's going downhill, as it were. The issue, very quickly, I mean, for prisons on this particular area of Islamist recruiting, is that they are, as he says, very fertile ground. You've got people who are already, of course, disenfranchised from the state, disenchanted with the state. You have people who are very capable recruiters and inciters. That's why they're there. And, of course, there is the gang element, that it is a gang to be part of. And in prison, being part of a gang, particularly a strong gang, is of great importance.
And, Tom, your experience is obviously in the prison system. Do you think Islamic radicalisation is one of the biggest problems that prisons now face?
I think what Ian does incredibly well in this piece is he captures the link between cuts and broader problems in prison management and radicalisation, because effectively what we've seen is a sort of 25% reduction in prison staffs, cut from 25,000 to about 18,000, and what it's done effectively is increase the distance between officers and inmates. There's much, I suppose, mathematically there's less contact, but also there's sort of less control and less understanding of what's going on in the prison. And this is very important when it comes to questions like radical Islam, because done well, religion is a force for good in people's rehabilitation, and it can allow them to reform their identities into a much more positive state. But for many prison officers with limited training and experience, it's very hard to determine the difference between good Islam and bad Islam. And actually, one of the problems can be that, and this was discovered in a study by a Cambridge criminologist, Alison Liebling, in Whitemoor in 2011, was that officers would tend to see all Islam as bad Islam. And of course, what that in a sense does is it forces people into quite a negative grouping together, and it puts your radical Islam with your positive Islam, but it also places those in legitimate Islam on the outside, and that I think can create a very pernicious dynamic. So these are complex dynamics contributed to by problems in prison management.
There's a flip side of that as well, which is the way in which any form of sort of religiosity, as it were, can be seen to be a useful structure for a prisoner. So that, I mean, some people who convert, for instance, are in prison, are likely to give up the drugs, and so on. That is a beneficial thing in the short term for many prison warders. But yes, I mean, this issue of cuts, which Ian's piece mentions, which Tom just mentioned, it is obviously a very serious one. The retention rate is particularly serious at the moment.
And in London, there are particularly acute problems in terms of recruiting staff, partly because of housing costs and so forth. It's not a particularly attractive job now because the job's got harder. You're managing more people. Everyone knows that prisons are difficult places to be. Rates of suicide have doubled over the last 5 years, which is deeply worrying, from about 60 to about 120. Rates of violence and self-harm have gone up as well. So officer attacks have gone up considerably, and this is a big issue. Again, the dynamics of prisons are fascinating because you have to think about what happens when an inmate attacks an officer. There are two human responses to that, in my view. Either you go towards the confrontation and you say, well, I'm not going to have this. I'm actually going to often reassert my authority, but often with aggression and violence of some sort, hopefully controlled. But that leads to basically inmates then retreat and don't provide as much affection and relationships. They don't share information in the same way. The other response, of course, is that actually officers become scared and they retreat. Again, less information transfer, less information flow. And on topics like radicalisation, this is important. It's also very important on things like suicide and self-harm, because you're trying to look out for all the triggers that can tip people into self-destructive and destructive behaviours. A letter from the wife breaking up. How do you know about that? How do you know that that's happened? How do you know that someone's in debt to somebody else because of drug sale, for example. And those are the sorts of triggers that you need to be aware of and looking out for in prisons. You need exceptional management and you need the right levels of staffing.
Talking about wardens, in Ian's piece he suggests that he uses the phrase institutional timidity is to blame, and that political correctness is becoming a problem as well, with people not actually wanting to confront these issues for fear of seeming racist. Do you think that's becoming a bigger problem?
I have to be honest, I think that we've known about this issue for quite a long time and yet haven't seen much action on it. And I think that's the worrying thing. And I think if I was going to be quite critical, I would say that we've had too many Secretaries of State for Justice over the last 6 years doing very different radical reform programmes, none of which focused on the core basics of how to run a prison well and took it for granted. We had some of the safest prisons in the world in 2011, and that's changed significantly over the last few years. We were basically getting too complacent about the fundamentally difficult job of running a prison. I think that's a real shame. And we weren't willing to. I think none of those Secretaries of State were willing to say it's very hard to manage the numbers of prisoners we now have at the cost that we can afford to pay. And we might actually have to think about relaxing some of the sentencing reforms that have been going through recently. It's a big issue, but that's something they didn't bite off.
That issue, if I can say so, of institutional timidity, Ian Aitchison credits the fact that it's a term which was used by Dame Louise Casey, in her recent review in Integration in Britain. This thing of institutional timidity, I mean, it is a huge problem, and he opens up the prison part of it, but it exists, as Louise Casey saw, in other things as well, in other institutions of state. And the specific thing is concern that effectively every part of the state has to become highly knowledgeable about the theology of Islam, looks at it, gets very worried, either sees it all looks bad or thinks it all looks good, and I would argue that the latter is the more prevalent one in the public sector, and then just sort of panics. And in the context of prison, and as I say, into control and the necessity of keeping things quiet and so on, this is a particularly serious problem. And one of the reasons why Michael Gove wanted Ian Aitchison to look into this was, who is teaching people about Islam in prison? Who are the imams? Who are the people who go in? Because it isn't just about the people who are already inside prison preaching, it is about who is coming from outside. What are their materials? What are their qualifications? In other words, what type of Islam do we think is official state Islam in Britain's prisons? And frankly, if we had that conversation with anybody in any position of seniority, they wouldn't know what we were talking about.
And the truth about that is, in a sense, prisons are the perfect environment in which to control some of those things. There's not access to the internet in the way there is in mainstream society. Yeah. You can control which books are in the libraries to a significant degree, if we were still allowed books in prison libraries, which was a bit of a debate a few years ago. And so I think that you can do things, and I think some of the measures that Ian sets out in his piece are very, very sensible indeed.
Just finally, Ian also suggests that the success of our security service accelerating the problem. Do you think that's a fair position?
Very little way to quantitatively prove this, but certainly anecdotally, I think this is true. As he describes, one of the successes of security services, the police, in recent years has been stopping things further upstream than they had been able to stop them in the past. Very occasionally, the statement from the head of MI5, for instance, talking about the number of plots that have been thwarted or prevented. And necessarily, once that doesn't happen, it means that you've got in earlier, and that, yes, there are more people that are likely to have been rounded up and prosecuted. There has been a very significant increase in prosecutions in recent years, successful prosecutions. That's because of an increase in the number of plots, which means an increase in the number of people in prison, which means an increase in the number of serious people in prison who can influence a more junior or more ripe figures. And this is certainly a serious part of the problem. But let's face it, I mean, it's a net boon in the most obvious way. It's much better that they're in prison than that they're out on the streets.
So another thing that I wanted to raise was, in Ian's piece, he has a proposal to segregate, effectively, people who have more extreme Islamic views. And I think that's potentially a double-edged sword.
Yes.
I'm very cautious about it vis-a-vis terrorism in Northern Ireland and what happened when we did that there. I don't know how much evidence we can draw on here, but I would be quite worried about it. It's an interesting theory that this will make things better, but can we observe how it works in practice before implementing this on a grand scale and find out we've actually made the problem worse? And this is true of a number of areas of policy, and particularly in relation to radicalisation, because the evidence base is so thin. Think about we have very few lone terrorist attacks, for example, but they are very serious serious things, we tend to base our assumptions on the last case or some good theory. And I think that's a big area of risk here. We need to start building the evidence base and thinking about what actually works in de-radicalisation in prisons.
Yes, but just very quickly, both of these problems, if you disperse and diffuse most serious offenders among the rest of the prison population, the possibility that they reach and radicalise people across areas obviously exists. If you put them into one place, there's a possibility of hot housing. There was, by the way, in recent years, a very unfortunate situation, I think, of people in Belmarsh, which effectively was people on one side of the canteen who were radical Islamists and people on the other side who were people who were Irish Republicans. I always thought that the danger was that one day somebody would go across and speak to the other group, because the one thing the Irish Republicans had that the Islamists didn't have was extraordinarily good bomb-making knowledge. So even that, putting two ideologically different groups of people who were both extremists in the same prison, has its own problems. So, as Tom's just said, I mean, this does need a better evidence base before leaping right in and doing something that could be very detrimental indeed.
That was Douglas Murray and Tom Gash.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.